Welcome to everyone who is here tuning in to our fantastic event this afternoon. I will be your gracious chair, your hostess, with I hope all of the things that I need to have in front of me. And what I am going to be doing is outlining some important parameters for today's book launch, today's launch of Dianna McCaulay's fifth novel, Daylight Come. So the countdown begins now. We will have 90 minutes to launch this novel, yet we are already on borrowed time if we are going to halt, if not reverse, the ill effects of climate change. Now, because we here in Jamaica are one of the small island states, we are particularly vulnerable. So I do hope that you are tuning in with a keen interest to bring about change. This event is Literature as Warning and Climate Change. These are the topics that we're discussing today. So as I said, I am your host, Dr. Isis Samaj Hall of the Department of Literatures in English at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in Jamaica. And we're just gonna move straight along into this program. I will welcome all of our guests today and then provide you with some biographical information about them. And then we will move into a book review, a reading from the text, the author's response, and of course, a panel discussion. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the very end, which is after the panel discussion. And just as a heads up, for those of you who have not yet read Daylight Come, you can purchase this great novel from local bookstores in Jamaica, such as Kingston Bookshop, and also from Rebel Women Lit. It's available on Amazon UK, but the US release is not until November. So tune in now, get all of the information that you need about Dianna McCaulay, about climate change, and about what you can do to bring about change. So let me just give a bit of information. Actually, no, I won't give information. I will turn this over to the head of the Department of Literatures in English, Dr. Rachelle Mosley Wood, who will bring greetings for today.
Thank you, Isis, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. As Isis told you, I'm Rachelle Mosley Wood, head of the Department of Literatures in English. We may have a very wide, far-flung audience today. So for those of you who do not know that much about the UWI, the Department of Literatures in English is a small department with only 8 academic and 2 administrative members of staff, but we're home to 4 BA programs, the BA in Literatures in English, Liberal Studies, Film Studies, and as of September, the BA in Writing, Literature, and Publish. And of course, we also offer postgraduate programs, the MA, MPhil, and PhD, all in Literatures in English. Anyone who has been even remotely connected to the department would know that in pre-COVID times, we maintained a very healthy schedule of events, including book launches, film screenings, and career building activities for students. But I must admit that since March, when we had to cancel one of our major annual activities, March is Movie Month at Mona, because of the COVID-19 crisis, we have been slow to jump on the online bandwagon. So I really have to thank Dianna for giving us this opportunity to jump into online life and host our first ever virtual book launch, because we simply could not pass up the opportunity to host the launch of Daylight Come, a gripping speculative novel about what life might look like in the future if we do not heed the warnings and begin to take good care of our home, Mother Earth. It was Dianna's idea that we organize a panel discussion as part of the launch, and we were eager to embrace this proposal. We first did something like this in November 2019 when we organized a premiere of Esther Figaro's revealing and visually breathtaking documentary, Fly Me to the Moon, about the global aluminium industry and bauxite mining in Jamaica. That premiere featured not one, but 2 panel discussions. So we are very happy once again to have the opportunity to host a discussion that brings together experts in fields other than literature and film. But although this might be the first time that the experts we have here today might be participating in the launch of a novel, we feel very comfortable playing host to this discussion, for it serves to demonstrate the importance of stories in our lives and the ways in which they are connected to real and pressing issues that we face every day. Stories, whether in film or literature, are not merely a distraction and form of leisure. They are also time-honored means of exploring, connecting with, and understanding the deepest parts of our inner selves, as well as the wide world in which we live. And that is why we maintain the importance of the disciplines we teach in the department and their connectedness to real life issues like sustainable development and the climate crisis. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and for all of our panelists and participants, and of course, Dianna. Thank you, and continue to watch and stay logged on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mosley Wood. We're now going to turn this over to a book review courtesy of Dr. Therese Ferguson. She's a lecturer in the Education for a Sustainable Development program in the School of Education. So thank you, Dr. Ferguson.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to share this review and thereby the opportunity to read this gripping novel. The science is clear. Climate change is happening. The impact is real. The time to act is now. These are extracts from a speech by then United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the 2007 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali, Indonesia. Short statements, yet powerful in their succinct, direct, and unequivocal representation of the reality of climate change, the undeniable challenge for the global community and small island developing states, such as those in the Caribbean. In her science fiction novel, Daylight Come, author Dianna McCaulay fast forwards her readers to the year 2084 on the fictional Caribbean island of Bajaku, where the current climate crisis has continued to unfold with stark, alarming, and seemingly otherworldly impacts, perhaps worse than we ourselves could have envisioned. Through the mother and daughter characters of Bibi and Sorrel, along with other characters who we meet at various points on their journey, readers are invited into a frightening future, one where the sun now burns so hot that people are relegated to working at night and sleeping during the day. What is it about this novel that makes it such a powerful, poignant, and profound read for its audience? For me, I think there are three important aspects. Firstly, there is the vivid, realistic portrait of the dark dystopian future that awaits us if climate change mitigation, adaptation, and education are ignored or are not pursued with seriousness and fervor. Secondly, there are the characters through whose eyes we not only see this future, but through whom we live it. Thirdly, there are the emotions that McCaulay awakens in her readers. So let us begin with the dystopian future to which McCaulay transports us. This is a future that Bibi herself, as a child, watched unfolding before her eyes. She tells us about news reports she saw of melting ice, swirling snowstorms, cities swallowed by earthquakes. We saw people washed away by rivers that broke their banks, taking villages with them. We watched whole islands drown. It is a future of dust storms and of sun that blinds and kills. This is a future in which every child has to do basic survival training. It's a future where having efficient sweat glands are key to living beyond your childhood years, and where young girls rarely have menstrual periods because of poor nourishment and a sedentary lifestyle. And it is a future where those over the age of 40 face anger and danger because they knew the perils of climate change and did not do enough to stop them. As one of the characters, McCaulay's, says to Sorrel, "I tell you who's hard-hearted. Those old people, dead now. They left us this world to deal with, and they knew what would happen. But they kept right on with their meat every day, and their homes with rooms no one went into, and their holidays. I hate every generation before this one. I hate it that I'll never have a chance to confront them." Secondly, I have to speak of the characters. This future is lived through an array of colorful characters, the primary two of which are Bibi and our 14-year-old daughter, Sorrel. The duality of 14-year-old Sorrel enraptures me, and I believe will enrapture you. On the one hand, she is a strong, courageous, fierce youngster who challenges her mother to move past her fear and flee their home in Banna City and head to the mountains to perhaps find other young people that she can relate to, and a somewhat more tenable opportunity to have a future that means something in the midst of their current reality. This fierce courage is underpinned by her own realization early on that to survive, she will need to be cunning, ruthless, and opportunistic. On the other hand, she is still a youngster who needs her mother. She's only 14 years old, and she begins the journey with her mother, even though she knows that it would be easier to journey without her. 45-year-old Bibi is a quiet woman, yet one with a hidden strength and fierce determination, willing to risk sacrificing her own life so that her daughter can have a chance at a better one, holding on to the promise made to Sorrel's father that they would do whatever was necessary to keep their daughter safe. In addition to Bibi and Sorrel, you will meet Sesame, McCaulay's, the Zora, Raptor, Slate, and Kez, fellow compatriots on this journey to survive and to build community on the way, each with their own unique personalities and experiences. You will also meet the evil Colonel Drax, and I won't speak about him. Thirdly, and finally, McCaulay's novel triggers a myriad of emotions within us through the terrifying future she outlines, the vivid imagery she utilizes, and the relationships that we see form and develop. We feel horror when we witness the brutal murder of an old woman by two young men simply because she is old and representative of those individuals of the preceding generations who saw the climate crisis unfolding and did nothing to stop it. Could that be us one day? We feel fear and anxiety as we journey with Sorrel and Bibi from Banna City to the mountains. We feel physical repugnance when we hear of Colonel Drax's deeds. And of course, we experience the love that underpins Bibi's and Sorrel's relationship. For many readers, the overriding emotion may well be unease, as by 2084, as I said before, we too would be amongst those hated by the coming generations for our own roles and inaction in the current climate crisis. So McCaulay has engaged our imaginations and our emotions with what worse awaits us if our current way of doing business, our current livelihoods, our current consumption and consumerism, our current values remain unchanged. For those involved in environmental education, you may recall the threefold head, heart, and hand approach to environmental education. The head for producing understanding and awareness in our minds and consciousness. The heart for stimulating value and concern through, for instance, the awakening of emotions. And the hand for provoking action. Through her novel, Macaulay similarly engenders a head, heart, and hand approach. She stimulates our thinking and enhances our knowledge. She stirs our emotions quite powerfully. And hopefully, this stimulates a change in our lifestyles and behaviors so that a different future awaits us, one diametrically opposed to that depicted in her novel. I therefore hope that readers will not only view Daylight Come as an interesting and emotional read, the quote-unquote escape that literature offers us, but I also hope that readers will see Macaulay's novel as a prophetic warning that they will take tangible action to avoid. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that stimulating book review. It's very provocative and I really appreciate that. Next up, we will have a reading from one of our own students in the Department of Literature and English, an award-winning poet and a published writer in her own right, Yashika Graham.
Do you want me to just introduce what Yashika is going to read, Isis?
I think that would be perfect, actually. So thank you, Diana, for that.
Okay,
please,
so
yes, let's get oriented.
Just thanks to everybody for organizing this, especially the Department of Literatures in English. And Yashika, thanks. I'd be a lot more nervous if I had to do the reading. So I'm grateful you're going to do it. Essentially, this is, as Therese said, thank you for that review, Therese. This is a story of a mother and a daughter trying to find a better way of life where, at a time in 2084 where it's become too hot to go outside in the day. And the book is told from two points of view, from the point of view of the mother, Bibi, and the 14-year-old daughter, Sorrel. So the two passages Yashika are going to read are from those different points of view. And she's going to start with Bibi, who is going to tell you a little bit about how all of this happened, how all of this unfolded. She has her own stories, and she has the memories of her mother and grandmother, so that for a reader, you get a little bit of a sort of backstory about how this actually happened. And then the second reading is from Sorrel's point of view, where she's convinced her mother to leave the Bana, the main city, and travel to try and find this more comfortable, more normal way of life in the hills. And they have to travel at night because it's too hot to go outside in the day. And so they've sort of gotten almost through their first night of travel, and they desperately have to find shelter when they are caught in the open by feral animals. And this has become a real problem in 2084, where the sort of domestic animals that we've all raised for years there's so many of them that they've become feral and have started to chase and feed on human beings. So Sorrel and her mother are trapped underground in a sort of a tree root shelter. They know the ferals are outside, they've lost all their supplies, and they have to decide what to do next. And so now I'm going to hand over to Yashika.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Dr. Samaj Hall. The first reading is chapter 4, titled Bibi. They called it different things: change, then crisis, followed by emergency. Then they changed it to disruption, then disaster. In the end, it didn't matter. Finally, you never knew who they were, realized that the worsening climate converged with poverty, geography, and history. So now they call it the convergence. I was 11 and lived with my parents in the foothills overlooking Bana. Higher elevations were cooler, so we were luckier than others. And I believed we deserved it. Every night, my mother and father watched good-looking men and women on television report on melting ice, swirling snowstorms, cities swallowed by earthquakes. We saw people washed away by rivers that broke their banks, taking villages with them. We watched whole islands drown. All this was far away. I thought the news was boring and had nothing to do with us. The decapitated mountains were not ours, nor were the children swept away by raging water. I remember the sizzling morning I went to the Ray Wharf with my mother and saw the fishers leaning against the rum shop, the women facing them with empty baskets, their faces slick with sweat. No more fish, the men said, but we have a few sea eggs. My mother responded that we were not that desperate. Not long after, the crops began failing and the fruit trees stopped bearing. We tried to grow some things in our garden, but they all died. I remember this one pumpkin vine which produced a flower and then a pumpkin. My parents watched it as if they were tending a sick child. Then, one morning, it was gone. Someone too hungry to wait, my father said. After that, the vine withered and died. The water supply failed in Bana, and I went with my father to Alma River, which still had pools of water. Thousands of people lined its crumbling banks carrying containers. Rich people put pumps in the pools and sucked them dry into tanks in the backs of their trucks. I remember I had to walk a long way to find a pool that was not stirred up. I don't remember the journey back to our car with my water bucket full, but it must have been difficult. I went to campus school until I was 15. I was good at tech support. Halfway through my final year, the power supply could no longer support air conditioning. I never went back. I remember the cars strewn around Bana after the roads melted until a storm lifted them and cast them in the sea. They stopped giving hurricanes names, human names, the year of the Cat 5. That storm was Theater 24. We became trapped in cycles of flood and drought. The pandemic of 2020 had already shut down country borders, but the viruses had found their animal hosts and they sickened us in waves. The animals we let loose to roam and graze the almost barren land mostly starved and died, then shriveled into ash. A few horses and mules survived and did not become feral. The pigs and dogs that survived banded together in feral packs and began to hunt and feed on us. We tried poison and traps, but they bred too fast. Then it became too hot to go outside in the day. The dust storms started and the sun began to blind and kill. Our neighbor, Nima, was the first I knew to die. A quiet, soft-spoken woman made cantankerous by thirst and hunger. She tried to scratch out her husband's eyes and he threw her out. All we heard was the bang of the front door and then her screams. No one opened their doors to her. I did not ask my parents why. I still think of my father and the way he died. He was out all night at the seawall foraging for food. Daylight caught him there. He tried to get into one of the dawn bunkers, which still existed then. The people inside would not open the door. They shouted to him that there was no room, no more room. I never saw his body, and I don't know how the Domins who brought the news knew who he was, because there was nothing left. All they gave my mother was his wedding ring. For a long time, I thought about the bones. I didn't believe the sun could destroy bones, at least not so quickly. And I imagined the gold ring loose around a finger bone, almost against the blackened dust. I almost thought about the food he might have found, which we did not get. I wondered who would have taken the food and left his ring. I didn't witness what the sun could do to people until after Sorrel was born. I was always sorry she saw it too. Now, my headstrong daughter, my only child, wants to abandon the safety of the dark. I tell her tribals don't exist, that they are a myth, that the young have created to hang on to hope, but the toplanders are real. I've seen classified reports about the Toplanders and their raids on young lowlander females to use as slaves. The raiders are led by a cruel, reckless man the reporters call the Colonel. There was Essan, a girl Soril's age, who disappeared while she was out searching for food. And we knew it was the Domins who'd caught and sold her to the Toplanders. And Amaryllis snatched from her doorstep in the presence of her parents and never heard from again. What I know for sure is that in this time of killing, heat, and hunger, there is no safety anywhere. Every day the sun comes up, it will blind our kids. Every day, the Domins are on the hunt for young women, and the ferals can surround us and tear us apart. I'm 45, and the end is coming fast for me. What use am I without passage is chapter 8, Ferals. Sorrel woke, washed in sweat and disoriented, surprised to have slept at all. She was cramped and stiff, but didn't want to wake Bibi by moving. It was lighter in the tree cavern. She looked at the intricacies of the root system that sheltered them. What kind of tree had it been? A big one, perhaps centuries old. Were the roots living or dead? If dead, why had they not decayed? Maybe the soil was too sterile. A ray of sunshine touched the ground at her feet, and she assessed its angle. Had to be past midday, the hottest time. The silence of the day lay over the charred land. She wanted food. She wanted more than alganola. She remembered her Grammy's stories about the time before the convergence, how people got on airplanes to fly to other countries and the food they ate. We used to complain about how the food was awful, she had said. What kind of food? Sorrel had asked. By the time I flew, there was no more food. But my mother used to talk about it. Food. Grammy told this story dozens of times, but every time a new detail was revealed. The tall buildings in New York, air conditioning and heat, restaurants, people selling food from wagons and stalls in the street, flowering trees, parks with green grass, people outside in the day, rushing to their jobs and families, jogging with earphones. We thought there was no going back, ever. Grammy always said this at the end. We thought everything would get better and better forever. What did you miss most? Sorrel said. Patties, her grandmother said. Bibi stared beside her. Sorrel saw the glint of her mother's eyes. You slept? She said. Some. I'm stiff. Me too. It'll take me an hour to unwind. Hungry too. Let's eat something. Drink a little too. Find the knife. You have better eyes. Has the feral left? We need to know if there's only one. Sorrel squinted at the land outside. The sun could blind you. There was the canine lying in the narrow shadow cast by a rock. It had returned, or perhaps it hadn't left. A pork snuffled at the sandy soil in the blazing sun. At least one canine and one pork, she said. How have they survived outside? Small, fast, good at finding shelter, eat anything. Why didn't the Domins hunt them before? They were so many. We could have eaten them. Bibi shrugged. They tried back in the day. They bred fast, hid well. Some were killed and eaten, but then people got sick. I don't know. I hope they didn't get into the other pack. We should drink. Look for the big knife. The water was warm and thick and failed to quench Sorrel's thirst. She rooted in the backpack and found some alganola and the kitchen knife. A little luck, she said, giving it to her mother. The ray of sunshine softened and retreated. Eventually, twilight settled around them and they breathed more easily. We don't have much time before it'll be full dark, Bibi said. She groaned as she tried to move her limbs. We can't stay here through another day. We need the other backpack. I know. How big are these ferals? Sorrel shrugged. Compared to what? Can you stand? I think so, but we should think about what we're going to do. You and your plans. Give me the knife. The canine will go for your throat, Bibi said. Sorrel stood outside the root shelter, her back to the giant boulder, knife in hand. She could just see the shapes of the two ferals, their heads turned away. She tried to judge the distance, 10, maybe 15 meters. Come out, she whispered to Bibi. You go right, Bibi said. I'll go left. I'll take this back. You'll be able to lift the other one more quickly. Then we run. Sorrel spotted the second backpack just as the canine's head turned in her direction. She could no longer see the pork. The feral faced towards her, closing the distance in seconds. It skidded to a stop just outside of kicking range and snarled. Its yellow teeth were ringed with black, and she thought of carrion. Then it jumped for her throat, and she felt its hot breath on her face. She sidestepped and lashed out with her knife. It circled low to the ground, growling. She kicked and it dodged her foot easily. It leapt to her chest while she was off balance, and she slashed out again, disgusted by stinking, rotting breath. Her knife sliced the canine's neck and it yelped. She stumbled and fell, rolling away from it as fast as she could. Where was the pork? How badly had she cut the animal? She jumped to her feet and looked around. No sign of the canine. There was a trail of blood through the sand, leading into the rocks. She had fought off a feral and she yelled in triumph. Then she heard the sound of struggle somewhere behind her and ran in the direction of the root shelter. Bibi's back was against the big rock. A small pork was standing in front of her, swinging its tusks. Sorrel kicked the animal with all her strength. It swung around to face her, lowered its head, and charged. She screamed and sliced at it, kept slicing until the knife went in through muscle to bone. The pork squealed and fell, pulling the knife out of her hand. Make sure it's dead, Bibi panted. What happened to the canine? I cut it and it ran off. She went over to the pork. Its eyes were open and glassy, and it looked well-fed. She wrinkled her nose at its smell and pulled her knife free. They stood together, hands on their knees, their breathing harsh. Sorrel wanted to howl at the sky. That's a lot of food, Bibi said, nodding in the direction of the dead pork. We should have learned how to hunt them. Pity we have to leave it. She met her daughter's eyes. You keep the knife, she said. You go first, Sorrel said to her mother. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yashika, for that reading. There's the strength that we need, right? For those of you who have not yet read, you are now lucky enough to have Yashika's voice in your head as you enter into the text. And for those who have read, imagine this now, right? Imagine this now with this sound. So thank you so much, Yashika, for that reading. We will now have the author's response, which means that we will be hearing from Dianna McCaulay. She is an award-winning Jamaican writer and an environmental activist. She's also my friend. She's an outspoken environmental activist, and she founded the Jamaica Environment Trust in 1991. And she retired as CEO in December of 2017. She's committed herself to numerous environmental causes, including the protection of cockpit country. Daylight Come is Dianna's 5th novel, following her previous 4 novels, Dog Heart in 2010, Huracan in 2012, Gone to Drift 2016, and the self-published White Liver Gal in 2017. Please let us welcome Dianna McCaulay.
Thank you so much, Isis. Cue the rain, maybe a rain bomb now, who knows? So yes, I have spent a good 30 years, I guess, now coming up as an environmental activist. But my earliest ambition, the first thing I wanted to do was to write books. And it came about as a result of being just a voracious reader. My mom told me I could read before I was 4. And the desire to move people by the way I had been moved by stories. So, but, for most of my life, I wrote all my life. It's how I made sense of the world, but really only started to finish the things I had started and look for publication much, much later in life. So I came at this book really from 2 different perspectives, those 2 perspectives. One was informed by my long concern about, what's these days called the natural environment, which I've come to find a rather distancing term. But nature, the things that we unfortunately take so much for granted, but are a very integral part of what we regard as our home place. The things that ground us, that tell us where we are in the world and in relation to each other, and where our lives play out, And, I sort of, my environmental life started with this concern with the facts. That's why I'm so glad Prof is here. Because I thought, well, I had to be a scientist. They used to say of me in my early days as an environmental advocate, her heart's in the right place, but she has no training. And I set about getting training, and I set about being very certain of my facts. And I didn't really want to speak about things unless I had read very widely on them and, really knew really had data in my hands. But after years and years of doing environmental education, with the Jamaica Environment Trust in schools and then, among sort of public audiences, community audiences, and then more recently, public campaigns, I felt like what we needed was stories. That science, it was good to know your facts, but in the end, it was going to be passion that persuaded. It was going to be the ability to make people feel what all of this that I could see unfolding, and was frankly grieving what it really meant for us as island dwellers, island-born people, and actually citizens of the planet. So I wanted to kind of bring together these 2 parts of my life. And about 3 summers ago, I was traveling and I saw a story of a heat wave in the Middle East where they were building, and I think it was Qatar, but don't hold me to that, a Middle Eastern country where it had become so hot that the people who were on scaffolding, doing construction, they fell off the scaffolding and some of them died. And I started to think about, well, what would happen, especially, in a place like Jamaica, if it was too hot to go outside during the day? And what would happen if, in response to that, we started to work during the night and sleep during the day? So that started to sort of bother me. And when I came home, I found for a period of months me driving around, walking around, just going about my daily life, noticing those who were working outside. And it included me sometimes because I had a certain amount of field work as an environmental activist, but it also included the most enormous number of occupations that we take for granted, people directing traffic on the side of the road. You see some road construction going on and you see somebody standing there with a piece of red bandana and a bush, and they're telling some cars to go and some cars to stop. And they're the people doing the road construction themselves. They're farmers, they're security guards. There are people building houses. There are people selling on the side of the road. And I just started to notice the sort of large amount of outdoor life we had in Jamaica, and how many people it was supporting in terms of a livelihood. And that's the beginning of this thinking, you know, what would happen if it was too hot to go outside in the day? And then in the mysterious way that these things happen, I really can't give you any insight into where characters arrive. They sort of do. I mean, my own practice is I go to bed at night with whatever problem I've posed in my fiction, which is often that I've written somebody up a tree and I have no idea how to get them out of the tree. But whatever problem, you know, so who's going to be the protagonist, who's the antagonist, you know, what's going to happen in this story? I sort of go to bed at night with those questions in my head, in my mind. And very often, more often than not, I wake up in the morning with some of the answers. So the characters were revealed to me over time. But I knew I wanted it to be a story of tension between a mother and a daughter. And I knew I wanted it to be a story of what responsibility do people my generation have to the generations to come about the way we have ignored and put off the climate crisis. So that's some of the sort of genesis of the book. Of course, in writing fiction, much is revealed to you. You know, you don't start, well, I don't start with the end in mind. And as I think I'd be bored if I knew how it was all going to turn out. And in the course of writing it, you know, the characters came to me and the events in the book came to me. And it was very beautifully edited by People Tree Press. And I really say to anyone watching who's an aspiring writer, that the greatest gift in the world is a wonderful editor. Because by the time you have lived with, I mean, most books will take you 2, 3, maybe much longer in some cases, years to write. And by the time you come to the end of it, you're sick of it and you don't think it has a single piece of worth and you just wish it gone. And for someone else to take it and, you know, see the repetition that you've inadvertently included and the parts that don't really work and, you know, the stuff that you haven't done enough work on, that is a gift. And I really thank People Tree Press, Jacob Ross in particular, for his work as an editor. I think that's what I have to say about Daylight Come. I do hope it presents, the last thing I say is that everything that is put forward as a possible future has happened somewhere already. They have not all happened in the same place, and they may have happened a few times and not persisted, but everything that is there has happened somewhere. So this is not, the climate crisis is not somewhere in the future, it's already with us. The reason I set it in 2084, I wanted someone who's born today, well, it's a little nod to 1984, of course, but I wanted it for someone who's born today to be able to live to that time, to be about my age, in fact, in 2084. So I wanted this to be a near future time that is not so far in the past that we would tell ourselves we didn't need to think about it. So thanks to you all for coming to this book launch. Thanks to Yui again and all the panelists. I'm really looking forward to your response.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dianna, for that response, and also for giving us a bit of insight as to why it's placed in 2084. So perhaps there is a chance to do some good, to do something better. So we will now move into our panel discussion, and we are very, very fortunate to have a great team of panelists for this conversation on the climate crisis. All right, so who do we have? Well, we are joined by Dianna Jackson Miller of All Angles and Beyond the Headlines. She is the host of the 2 programs. Dianna Jackson Miller began her work life in environmental management after reading for a Bachelor of Science with a double major in botany and zoology, followed by an MPhil in zoology, both at UWI-MONA. She worked at the then Natural Resources Conservation Authority, which is now called NEPA, in the National Parks branch before changing careers and moving into media. With a postgraduate certificate in media law, a Master of Laws in Human Rights Law, and a postgraduate certificate in university teaching, Dianna is also a practicing attorney at law. She's a 2-time Journalist of the Year winner and has recently produced the well-received documentary Cockpit Controversy. So we have Dion Jackson Miller, and we are grateful. We also have Dana Lynn Swaby, a 2019 Chevening Scholar with an MA in Global Communication and Development. She is a communication practitioner with over 5 years experience managing the communication portfolio for local and regional climate change projects. She has represented Jamaica and the Caribbean at numerous forums internationally, including the United Nations Youth Climate Summit and COP25 Climate Change Conference. Her most recent involvement was a contribution to the development of a global youth engagement plan through the NDC Partnership Youth Task Force. Dana Lynn is also the creator and host of Global Yadi, a podcast series exploring culture, climate, and sustainable development with people across the globe. Our final participant on this panel discussion is Professor Michael Taylor, and we are happy to have him as well. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology. Dr. Michael Taylor is one of the leading international climate scientists. He's a recipient of the 2019 ANSA Award for Excellence in Science and Technology. He has served on a number of national and regional boards and committees, including Climate Change Advisory Board in Jamaica's Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, and the Advisory Panel on Climate Change for the Ministry of Land, Water, Environment, and Climate Change. Professor Taylor's research, which has produced over 100 publications and garnered over $20 million in research grants and funding for UE, has focused on determining the scientific impact of climate change in the Caribbean islands. It is important that I share with you all of that information because it brings to you how much expertise is in this conversation right now. So, if I may ask my participants here today to provide all of us who are tuning in with a few thoughts, would you be able to each speak perhaps for about 2 minutes each, giving your response to Dianna McCaulay's Daylight Come, and of course with this mind for climate change and this climate crisis? We can begin with you, Dion.
Okay, thank you so much, Isis. You know, when I'm telling people about Daylight Come, and I say, oh, it's a book about climate change, and then I have to hurry up and say, but it's a good book. It's a really good book, because you don't want to be giving people the impression that, oh, this is going to be some really heavy text, and they're going to have somebody beating them over the head and preaching at them. Because in terms of dystopian fiction, in terms of sci-fi, I just found it such a really good read. Once I started, I couldn't stop. And my thinking on it is that we need different tools in the toolbox when we're dealing with climate change. So I was looking up, for instance, some documentaries. There are a whole bunch of documentaries on climate change. The one that Michael Moore did has 10 million views on YouTube. And of course, we all know about An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore from 2006, and he's done the follow-up. And I was interested reading up on An Inconvenient Truth, and there were a lot of articles trying to gauge its impact. Did it get people to change their mind? Did it get people to change their behavior? There were studies that were actually done 1 month after the movie, after the film, had people's behavior continued in whatever it is the change had been. And the conclusion was that, there was short-term change, but not necessarily long-term. And I was thinking that's a lot of pressure to put on one single vehicle, and I think we do need different things. So I remember one of the most interesting sets of discussion around climate change I found actually came out of the movie The Day After Tomorrow, which was a movie about climate change, but happening very quick, very fast. And, movies had to throw in a couple of wolves and a kid separating from his parents and some drama and romance, teen romance, and a lot. But it helped to spark the conversation. And for me, this is exactly what Daylight Come helps to do. It's another tool in the toolkit for climate advocates, but it gets you thinking and it gets you feeling. And for me, interestingly, COVID helped make it so much more real because our lives changed so quickly because of COVID. And then suddenly it was easier to understand Daylight Come and the kind of changes we saw there. But my 2 minutes are up, so I'll stop there, and then can continue after.
All right, thank you. Absolutely, COVID does put this into a different kind of context. Dana Lynn, would you like to hop in?
Thank you, Isis. Good evening, or good afternoon, sorry, on London time, to the panelists and the audience. Now, about 2 weeks before I read the novel Daylight Come, I participated in an interview with international author Roman Krasnarek, who wrote a book, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. That was done by Red Cross, Red Climate Crescent, and it's a conversation between us two that is to go into a time capsule to be released 100 years later. And it made me cringe because I kept thinking after the conversation, how do I become a good ancestor? And it made me think about legacy. Even my work as a climate advocate, speaking, who is coming after me to say, what did I do years later when this capsule is open? If I have children or even relatives or even people from Jamaica, what is it that I would have left behind? And then I read the book 2 weeks later and I felt slightly afraid. And I'm like, Jesus, this is real now. Like, I'm reading the book, and it's sci-fi, but it's not sci-fi. As Dion mentioned before, these are the phenomena expressed in the book. Is anything that can happen or is happening. And one of the very impressionable things for me that I reflected on and also appreciated, the humanness, the human side of the relationship with Vivi and Sorrel. And I thought about Sorrel as a 14-year-old girl in 2084, and all her characteristics and the attributes that she possesses no different from any young person now. And really, to tell you the truth, it's not different from any young person 28 years ago. And this is what makes me scared as an advocate and scared as a human being, because we have the conversations, we encourage actions, and we are talking about different ways in contributing to the problem. But who is really listening? Are things changing? Because the book made me think about other person. Diana mentioned that she has been in this space 30 years now, and pressing for change. It really made me sit up at night, because I actually read it in the night, thinking that this is expressing the urgency of climate change, the phenomena that the book spoke about. I think one of the things I mentioned on social media to my audience is that for persons who really don't understand the science behind climate change, or they're afraid to engage with that, this book is really expressing the lived reality and what it is that we need to do. And as Dion mentioned, some people, when you want to push conversations about climate change, people think it's mutually exclusive, and it's weird. Like, we think that the environment is different and we don't have this connection to the environment. And really what it is, this book is showing that Earth was basically evicting us, because we weren't taking care of the property. It's really, that's really what it is. So for me, it's a profound novel, not because it was only creatively written, but it's just really a warning, of what will be possible if we are not buckling down. And, the talking is important, but action is what we need to do. And I easily see this as part of literature that can be incorporated in schools, so that young people can really reflect on this, because it's also emphasizing that we are the stakeholders, and anything that happens today, it's going to impact the next generation. So it's very important that we consider these things.
Thank you. Absolutely. And we'll get more into that point about the youth and what can youth do a little bit later on. So now I'd like to have Professor Taylor offer his thoughts in your 2-minute response.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by just congratulating Diana on a wonderful novel and thanking her for getting to this reading. I used to love to read so much. And in fact, I read it at night as well. And one night my daughter came in and saw me and she said, "What are you reading?" She's used to seeing me reading scientific papers. It was a fantastic novel. Really, for my 2 minutes, what I would like to say is this book gives me as a scientist the tools that I think Dion was referring to. very often as scientists, we struggle with communicating climate change. And suddenly here I have some beautiful passages which I can use now to really convey that. Our struggle is on multiple levels. One, we struggle to communicate, for example, the multi-hazard nature of climate change. And so we have to reduce it to saying it's temperature rise, it's rainfall, it's hurricanes. But here it is, here's a book that says, this is a multi-hazard problem, and we're going to live with all of these things, in the mix at any one time. And so I appreciated that a whole lot about the book. As scientists, we also struggle not just to kind of communicate that multi-hazard nature, but we very often struggle to communicate the risks and the threats. And we have to talk about the threat to food security, then we talk about the threat to water, and we kind of compartmentalize them. And, here is a book that suddenly puts it as what we want to be saying. It's a lived reality. The threat is a lived reality. It is climate change is not something divorced from our life. And when you put all of these things in the mix, climate change is this threat to our lived reality. And then I would say, the other thing that I think this book is going to do, it does not only beautifully play this multi-hazard context, it not only conveys this lived reality, but we struggle to convey the urgency of climate change. And in the passage that I think was read earlier, I'm picking it up back again, Dianna, it's page 26 in chapter 4, and it makes an interesting continuum about climate change. It says, they call it different things. Change first, then crisis, then emergency, then disruption, then disaster, and then it simply didn't matter anymore, and they called it convergence. Here is this continuum of what can happen. And it really challenged me to say, if this is a continuum, where exactly are we now presently in this continuum? I think we're beyond the change, which is the first, Where do we put ourselves? Is it crisis? Is it at the emergency? Is it at the disruption, especially when you think about what went on in Jamaica in terms of flooding over the last week? Hopefully we aren't at the convergence yet, which is a tipping point we often talk to about climate change. But I think this beautifully expressed that kind of continuum, which expresses the urgency to either not be at the convergence or to hold strain where we are in this continuum of change. I greatly appreciated reading the book.
Thank you for your response. I know I certainly look at the hills differently in Jamaica after having read Daylight Come. I really appreciate your comments. So, and also I want to thank you for giving some clarity to the multi-hazard threat. I think that's an important point. It's not just about temperatures rising and sea levels rising. There's much more to this climate crisis. So now I have a question that I guess I'll stay with you, Professor Taylor, and ask you this. What kinds of changes does Jamaica face as a consequence of climate change? And how serious and likely are the risks and outcomes that this book raises for Jamaica in particular?
Okay, thanks. So I'm going back to trying to be the scientist, trying to explain. But, we often explain in terms of the physical manifestations of climate change. And again, you find all of them represented in this book. We talk about the temperature threat, which is a real threat. It's the maximum temperatures, how hot it is becoming, but it's also consecutively hot days. And it's also the number of days in a year which are really, really, really hot, expanding, and that's a real threat that we are facing now, and which is picked up in the book. We talk about it in terms of the change in the character of rain, we're getting these long drought events and even years when we are in drought. But then we get a year like this year, which is just excessive rain, and we're just constantly swinging between these climate extremes. We certainly talk about it in terms of more extreme events, intense hurricanes. Did you pay attention to the news this morning? And it talked about the 5th hurricane to go towards the New Orleans area. This is just unprecedented kind of things. And of course, the higher sea levels, which cause the inland flooding. Those are the kinds of threats we're facing now in Jamaica. Jamaica. And those are the things that we are not facing one or the other of, but this kind of multi-hazard threat all at the same time, which we're going to have to figure out how to learn to live with. All of these are clearly picked up in the book in its depiction of how you live this new reality in climate change at a later point in the century and under what I would call tipping point conditions. But these are the physical manifestation threats. And just before, the book, however, then goes on to explore a number of themes in terms of what does this mean for life? The kind of things that we are talking about, the food security, the access to water, the things like and I think Dianna mentioned it in her introduction, the emergence of these new vulnerable groupings. One of the things as scientists we have been talking about is outdoor people are among this new set of climate. What describes island life is that we live in an outdoor setting, and all of a sudden, island life is under threat because we're creating a whole new set of climate vulnerable, including the outdoor people, the poor, the aged, the sick. All of these are picked up in the book. The inequitable access to resources and what eventually happens, conflict, health, sustainable cities. All of these are the risks of climate change, which are clearly articulated in the book.
Thank you so much. Definitely appreciate that. There's still much more that we can do, and certainly looking around in our communities, we understand that this reality is real. It's not just a fiction. So I'll make my next question go towards Dion Jackson Miller. Can you talk about this? How can we do a better job of communicating the risks of climate change and motivating people to act on this information? What do journalists need to know?
Yeah, I figured that question would come. And I've been thinking about it. I think one of the issues, I'm going to use the word problems in this context, because I think one of the problems is that people stop paying attention when all the information starts to sound the same, So you get yet another report coming out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and yes, it's raising alarm, but how different is it from the one that came out last year or the one that came out the year before? You're hearing concerns coming from UNEP, you're hearing concerns coming from the UIC group, you're hearing concerns coming from CARICOM, but reporters are always looking for new information. They're looking for new stories to tell. And I think right now, people are struggling with two things. One, how do you make this story sound new? And two, how do you make it relatable and understandable, which tends to take a lot more work. So for instance, I've been thinking about, planning, working on, a documentary on climate change now for, a couple of years now, and mine hasn't been done yet, And part of it is that same thing. What's going to be my angle? Where am I going to take it from? So you have the fishermen, you have the farmers, I got an idea for a hook a couple of years ago. Yeah, it takes a long time, but I haven't followed through on it yet. So, there's a wealth of information out there. My colleague, for instance, Kelisha Williams, had done this really, really nice piece last year. I don't know how many of you saw it, in terms of schools and heat, and linked it back to climate change in terms of just a difficulty our children are having, especially, of course, the ones in the lower income schools. You have one fan in the entire classroom. The kids were describing how they're hot, how they can hardly think, they can hardly focus because of how uncomfortable the environment is. And she put that within the context of climate change and concerns about how we're building and architecture. And it worked really, really nicely. But it takes time. Stories like that take a lot of time. So I think I'm taking a long time to answer your question, because there really is no easy way to answer it. It's just to keep pushing out the information, keep trying to connect with people, and to hope that we make the linkages. The terrible fires that are taking place now in, is it Colorado? You hear the descriptions of the residents who live there who can hardly breathe because of the smoke. There are so many things happening. There are stories there. We just have to go out and find them.
Thank you so much, Dion. And in hearing your answer there, it makes me wonder if in the production of your documentary and then also in your journalism, will you take a page from Dianna McCaulay and focus more on those narratives in order to push the information maybe more effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I do docs.
Thank you. All right, so now we have a question for Dana Lynn, and this question is, what role can children and young people play? I think you started to answer this earlier, so I just want to zero in on that and ask, what kind of impact have young activists had? What can they do? And how can we sensitize children in order to raise a generation of young people who are more sensitive to the issues of environmental sustainability?
Okay, so I heard 3 questions in that, but I'm gonna start with the first question about what role can children and young people play. Now, one of the things that young people do very well is amplifying the issues and also an action. So I think that's the very first thing that we can do. It's more urgent for youth because as the next generation, they're thinking this is what's going to happen to us if something is not done. And even just recently, I completed my dissertation investigating the lived experiences of Jamaican youth and their response to climate change engagement. And one of the things that came out of that research was peer influence and peer engagement and how well that worked. And a lot of young activists locally are now focusing on a lot of engagement activities. And it's not just about creating awareness of climate change, but it's about stimulating consciousness in a way that, we want to act. And when there are certain activities or events that seem organic and natural to what youth are doing, and when you have influencers among young people, then other people are going to want to be a part of that conversation, a part of that process. So I think as young people, that's a very important role. They're not only influencers we're not only influencers in our cohort, but as it relates to or teachers or parents, people among us, local community action, government agencies. When you see young people believe that something is important and they're investing time and energy behind a cause, a lot of times it creates traction, and it also builds further support to create an enabling environment to facilitate them making improvements and mobilizing resources to a certain cause. And I think especially in this era, youth tend to be more radical, they're apolitical, and they have that capacity to create independent change in a lot of ways. So that's something that, must be encouraged and it needs to be harnessed so that, they can continue to be change makers in their own spaces. Now, talking about what kind of impact young activists have had, still want to focus on Jamaican youth specifically. And I would like to just spotlight that there are several youth networks and organizations that are working at the local level, the regional level, and the international level to scale up climate action. Recently, at the start of the COVID pandemic, the Jamaica Youth Climate Change Youth Council, they did a series of COVID chats to spread awareness, through the digital space on climate change and sustainability, exploring the human dimensions of the pandemic so that people can think about these things differently. Dion mentioned, people stop paying attention when things start to sound the same. So a lot of young people are exploring new ways of spotlighting the climate conversation. As an example, my Global Yardie podcast, I decided to name it Global Yardie because I didn't want something that said climate change in it, and then people just listen and say, okay, this is not for me. So when I have a podcast episode that is speaking about Supermom saving the environment is sexy, according to the Supermom, who is a fashionista, who is an entrepreneur, but everything she does, she's incorporating climate change. So a lot of young people are also mobilizing other platforms and creative ways of engaging not just their demographics, but outside of the space in relation to climate change and community level activity. I hear USAT is engaging the International Court of Justice, reviewing the Paris Agreement to see how they can take legal action in Jamaica. That is something that is very, very encouraging. Quite recently, the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, the Jamaica chapter, they had engaged in a series of webinars and capacity building workshops that are, engaging their other youth to explore sustainable means of agriculture. They are now seeking funding to implement awareness workshops across the island, and also working on implementing strainers for drains in certain communities. And one of the challenges that a lot of youth have is that they don't have funding to carry out the things that they want to do. So some people become disengaged, and that is something that I also picked up in my research. People say, I don't know anything about climate change, but when I questioned them, they were able to make the distinction between trends, the impacts, and the socioeconomic effects. And I say, why are you not engaged in climate action? Why are you not joining this club? Some of them say they don't have an awareness of the solutions, or some say they're simply not anymore. They don't have any money and they're not able to mobilize funding. And some young people feel demotivated because of what they describe as tokenistic engagement. Yes, there may be awareness sessions. Yes, there may be seminars. And some say what they lack, or what is lacking, is the sustained engagement. So you have the willingness, you have the readiness in some spaces, and then there is this enabling environment that we really need to focus on building out, so you have young people who are ready. One of the things a lot of other young people are pushing is the fact that gone are the days when you hear about climate change and think it's just the scientists. The scientists, of course, have an important role because that's where the information comes from, but we want to inspire other young people. I'm a communication practitioner. We have coders in the Caribbean that are looking at how they can, use artificial intelligence, digital technologies to really find solutions. And a lot of young people are engaged in that. We have an organization called Caribbean Girls Hack. They are training young people and, to use their tech talents to find solutions to climate change. The Gleaner highlighted a story of two young men who are building out a game that is a locally relevant, climate change focused game to encourage other people to take care of their environment. So these are some of the things that young people are working on, and we want to encourage. Now, I think you asked a third question: how do we sensitize youth to take action, for the future? And I think it's about going back to culture and a renewal of cultural tradition. I had a conversation with a colleague, a friend, earlier this week, who we both collaborated on a climate change animated video series before. And she said she shared the video with her children, and they had questions. Is climate change happening? They were very afraid. They were very scared. And it may sound simple to a lot of people, but we're not having direct conversations about this, and that's how you stimulate consciousness. Webinars and conferences are very important, but when you really have intimate settings that you can have these discussions, it makes people think about the world differently, the problems and the challenges, and what we can do. And I think, we need more of those conversations. I mentioned before that I spoke with the author Roman Krznaric. He is a UK citizen. He mentioned that when it came for the time to vote, he had the manifestos, brought to his children, and they had discussions about it. And he voted in the interest of his children. His children decided who it is that they wanted to represent them, and they made that choice. And I think, we can borrow from that, and also stop pigeonholing certain kinds of information. Climate education to an extent is taught in school, but another way that we can sensitize students is when we understand that this is not just science, or this is not just a subject matter. How is it that we incorporate a lot of activities, even around the home, that, showcase the children that there is something bigger here than just something that I learned in school? Career days in high school and tertiary settings, how it is that we integrate sustainable education and showcase the young people that there are opportunities in every career to integrate and include climate considerations and sustainability, so that when they are in a particular positions or positions of leadership, they are now making decisions that will, that have positive implications for the environment and for the future.
Thank you for tackling all of those questions. I really appreciate that. And certainly the answers were very helpful to those who are listening and those who will tune in later on this YouTube. I have a question to kind of bring it back to Dianna McCaulay. And this question comes to you from the chat on YouTube. And this is from Emma Lewis. She's asking quite simply, where is the hope?
One of my favorite writers is Rebecca Solnit. And she wrote a book called Hope in the Dark. And it starts with a statement that the future is dark. And if she put a full stop there, you would think, well, this is not a hopeful statement at all. But she didn't put a full stop there. She went on to say, and that's as it should be. And her thesis is essentially that none of us know that the future is dark in the literal sense that we don't know what's actually going to happen. And it is in our hands to shape what emerges out of that future. And just by chance, this morning I read a little snippet from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who said, even in the day, the sky is full of stars. So I think humanity, if I can put it that way, have tremendous agency, particularly about this problem. Right? This problem, the understanding of what has caused this problem and what the fixes are have been understood for, I don't know, Prof, 80 years, probably, something like that, a good long time. And so the task is not that this is a problem facing us that we don't have the technology to solve or we don't know what caused it. It's more of a geopolitical problem of how to get our political leaders in the countries of the world, because this is not a problem of Jamaica or a problem of the United States or a problem of China or a problem of the United Kingdom or a problem of Africa. It's a problem of the collective of the entire world. And that really is the problem, is the task, is to get us as these disparate countries with these disparate priorities and at these different stages of development to act towards the future. And I don't want to downplay that is not a serious hurdle, but it is actually a matter of will. It is actually a matter of deciding, in the case of Jamaica, where the problems are severe, but they're a bit small, on a more manageable scale, so various simple things, building codes, how do we build houses that are not as susceptible to heat? Where we build, do we continue to build, as we've just had in the last week or so? People saying that, well, the reason that so many people have flooded out is because they're building in floodplains, they're building on very steep slopes, the turbidity of the water, which is directly as a result of deforestation. These are things that are absolutely well within our capacities. And when people ask me about hope, I always say, if you're a woman, and Emma is one such, you today can marry who you want, you can own property, you can have credit, you can have children as well, you can marry or not marry. These things were unheard of, 150 years ago. So the world does change. It is a mistake to think the world does not change. But the task in front of us now is to think about how to motivate ourselves and how to act and how to bring about the kinds of changes that need to happen. And the disconnect that I see is between what we say and what we do. So we will talk a very good talk about being concerned about climate change, but we'll give oil prospecting licenses, or we'll permit a very large hotel right on the Negril coastline, or we'll build housing in an area that has been identified as an aquifer protection zone. So we need to make the actions that we're taking match the rhetoric that comes so easily to us. And I find that something that can be tackled. I don't find it insurmountable.
If I could jump in terms of something on that issue of hope. I saw last night two fascinating stories. One coming out of Canada in relation to a claim that children had brought about climate change, saying the Federal Court of Canada just issued its order in the children's climate case against the government, agreeing that the negative impact of climate change to the plaintiffs and all Canadians is significant, albeit saying the matter was not justiciable. And another story coming out of Switzerland, where a group of self-described senior women delivered their climate change against the government to the European Court on Human Rights, saying the current pandemic has proven that prevention is people's best chance during a crisis. So why wait to address climate change until there's no way back? And this is one of the areas in which I would so like to see us progress in Jamaica. We're so fortunate to have had, well, not fortunate, as a result of intense lobbying. In our Charter of Rights, in our Charter of Fundamental Rights, we have a provision that entitles us to a healthy environment, right? We have not yet seen even one case adjudicated upon that particular provision of the Charter go to the Supreme Court. And we have seen that legal action works. Dianna can tell you she was involved in one case with Jet, in which the sewage plant out by Harbor View had been malfunctioning for almost 30 years. The Jet finally found a brave citizen to put his name on the claim, and the matter didn't even go to court because NWC caved, because, I mean, they were so obviously in the wrong, and a consent order was made to have the sewage plant fixed. And I really, really think that even while we do the lobbying, while we're doing the education, while we're doing the advocacy, we need to we need to litigate as well. We need to have groups and communities come together and say, you know, we're tired of begging, we're tired of talking, we're going to sue government. We need to see some of that.
About the language in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is actually that we're entitled to this productive and healthy natural environment free from the threat of damage to the ecological heritage. It's actually we're entitled to be free from the threat, and there are multiple threats. So I really agree with litigation as a productive course of action. Of course, it takes money and it takes courage, and it does take that affected citizen to put their name to such an action.
Yeah, I think though we've seen so many cases in which crowdfunding and crowdsourcing has been used effectively in all kinds of areas. I think the right claim, the right case, we could probably see citizen action and citizen money galvanized behind something like this. So, yeah.
Thank you all for these wonderful comments going back and forth. I'm looking at the time and I see that we have about 8 minutes left. So let's see what we can pack into those minutes as I think about some of the questions that are coming in on the chat. Now, here's a question from Danielle Campbell, and she asks, Dianna, why did you choose a mother-daughter relationship to tell this story? So I'd like to put that one on the table and then also allow space for others to answer this idea about how there's a gendered reality to climate change. So Dianna and everyone else can jump in there. Thank you.
Well, that's one of those kind of mysterious ways that creative work comes to you that I can't fully answer. But I do think that the relationship between mothers and daughters is one of the most profound in the human experience. And there's this intersection of that relationship, which of course takes place over many years and is not the same all the time. But the period that I find most interesting is the period in Daylight Come, where, you know, a girl is beginning to sort of detach from her mother's care and control and push away from her mother and resent in some ways her mother's role in her life. And the mother, of course, is resisting this, particularly in the kind of circumstances that are put in Daylight Come, which is very dangerous. She wants to protect her daughter, and above all things. And I wanted this very profound and deep relationship to be faced with this terrible choice, you know, of what do you do if either of or those two participants in that relationship have to make a choice about their own lives versus the lives of. So that's what interests me about the mother daughter relationship. And I'll stop there so you can ask others about the whole gender, which I think is a very important aspect to the climate crisis.
So who'd like to jump in?
Okay. So even though the question obviously was more focused on within the context of the book, but considering a gender lens to climate change, it's very critical, especially when we consider it's one of the things that helps to broaden the scope of how we discuss climate change and how we consider how climate change affects different groups, how it affects women, how it affects children, and then you invite the issue of social justice, and depending on people's economic, socioeconomic situation, then you do see how women and children are more affected by climate change. Women, depending on the sort of roles, not just as caregivers, but women in agriculture, and even when you think about water and access to sanitation, what are the implications for people who live in water stressed environments, females and children. So and nutrition, you invite that conversation, women who have to feed their households, and there's so many other aspects, women in leadership and climate leadership. These are the things that we want to stress as part of how we go forward and how we kind of have a balance as well. And it's about one of the encouraging things in the conversation as well, when you have more women taking up the mantle of climate leadership, female scientists as well, that is acting as an inspiration to the next generation. And I think the previous question is, what about hope? And I think one of the important things when you think about hope is about seeing what people, when you're questioning, can this thing be done? Seeing someone do it is a very, effective way of proving that it is possible. So when we think about gender equality, something that we continue to advocate and push for, when we really kind of spotlight how we want to make changes for women in the context of climate change, in the context of health, education, and everything else that encapsulates sustainability. When we're trying to push and make positive changes that way, it's kind of narrowing the injustices that we are crying out for in society. So I think continuing to have this consciousness and consideration is a very important part of driving the kind of change that we want to see.
Thank you. All right, I think we can take one last question before we have to end this great conversation, this important and critical conversation. How about this one from Doreen Duncan? Without giving too much away about the book, what does national leadership look like in this not too distant future?
Is that to me?
Yes, for
okay.
you, Dianna.
Well, difficult not to give it away, but I imagined a situation where, sort of government control was fragmented in a sense, that there was a breakdown then of the sort of government systems that a modern democracy would be used to, but at the same time, a kind of shadowy government force that keeps people in line by fear, really, is how I would say it. And one of the things I imagined as a situation, there is this kind of gender sort of aspect to the book, but I imagined a situation where all the hormones in the sea and in the food that we eat and stuff had made men to not very violent, much less violent, and and having children was rare. And that this sort of controlling force, which is called the domins in the books, had to get the men to be willing to fight. And they weren't very willing to fight. So this idea that they took boys, once the boys had a certain level of testosterone and the right hormones for maleness, they took them away from their mothers in early stages and trained them to be the soldiers and the violence producers of this new world. And this is sort of the kinds of things that Prof. Taylor was talking about, that this is sort of the many hazards, the many aspects of what could play out in our modern civilizations if we actually succeed in destroying the atmosphere, So yeah, the leadership is not a pretty picture. It's somewhat dystopian, rather like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, that kind of thing, where the government leadership is harmful to citizens. They're afraid of their government. They avoid them. It's fascistic. It's cruel. So that's my imagination anyway. We definitely hope for a different outcome.
And the issue of the global leadership, sorry, just 30 seconds, but the issue of the global leadership as well, the issue of the power relations between the North and the South, and how they're looking to these islands in the Caribbean with these big mountains, which are cooler, and, trying to take them by power. And, that was also a theme in The Day After Tomorrow. And again, it's something you can very realistically see as resources get scarcer and comfortable environments concentrate in the poorer countries.
Right. So the narrative that we used to know is that all the poor countries are fleeing to the rich countries.
Right.
But I suppose it wasn't like that at all. Suppose somewhere like Jamaica with some mountains and some diversity was actually a better place to be than the continents with, wildfires out of control and tornadoes and hurricanes and so forth. And that in fact we had this reverse colonization from the north to the south.
Right. I in fact found that one of the very interesting features of the book, because, climate migration because of climate conflicts was quite an issue now that is emerging. And you dealt with both kinds, because you dealt with migration from coast to mountain. So that's the internal migration in search of resources. But you also dealt with the kind of reverse migration. Instead of us going to the north, it's the north coming here for the and it was a very fascinating take on migration.
Thank you. I have one question that I'm hoping that you can all give maybe a quick answer to. And this question is adapted from a Michelle Rattray-Huche. And so the question that she posed is, what are the chances that this book could become a required text in Jamaican schools? But I'd like to adapt it to say Caribbean schools, right? Or small island states. What do you think about this being required reading?
I think that's probably a Yui question. I think it's quite hard. My experience as a novelist has been it's quite hard to get new local books as part of the curriculum. There's a sort of well-worn path that we trod, and it's not that easy, especially not for the writer, let me say, to get their books as part of the curriculum. So, I hope doing this kind of event does open some doors for that. But I say it's more question for people who are in education.
I remember, though, listening to Marcia Forbes talk about getting her book, one of her books, onto the Kate book list. And similarly, she spoke about how difficult it was, but she also spoke about the fact that she lobbied and she lobbied and she lobbied. And she wouldn't give up. And, she sent copies of books and she kept calling and whatever. So, I love the Caribbean novels that we currently have, but as I think it's Dana Lynn who said, I think this would be a really, really, really nice addition to the literature syllabus in the schools, and whatever we can do to help push it, because we need to be open-minded. The books from 50 years ago are all very well, but I mean there's some newer Caribbean books as well that our children need to be reading.
Definitely. I just also want to weigh in, having this experience where I'm currently studying or completed studies in the UK. One of the things I recognized that's very important is to actually emphasize our local knowledge and our story. And I think it's important, it's for representation in some context, and also just to instill a kind of pride in some ways, but especially when we look at the context. Going back to my research experience, when it's the irony that I picked up in the research, that some youth felt that climate change was serious, but then they thought about experiences, the international experiences like the ice caps melting and the glaciers, and they felt like, okay, things in Jamaica, it's bad, but it's not as bad as what's happening in other places. And then when I speak to other colleagues, it's the reverse, where they think that things, things elsewhere, it's really bad. But in the Caribbean, this is a serious situation when they learn about what else is happening. So I think in having a book like this in our education system is going to be important for people to really realize that we have to prioritize what our problems are in order to figure out ways that we can solve it or address it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all. If anyone
can I just make
yes, you would like to jump in? Yes.
Sure, right. So I cannot really speak in terms of the educational system in Jamaica, but at UE, we do have a new master's program in education for sustainable development. And there's a climate change education course, and I have already decided that I'm going to include this as one of the literary texts that we can utilize in that course. So there's definitely a pathway forward for including this in curricula at different levels.
All right. And if we don't have any other additional statements or comments that any of our panelists or readers would like to add, then we will be closing off. Yashika, anything to add? And panelists, anything to add at this moment?
I would just like to say thanks again. This is a wonderful call to action in terms of a book. It depicts kind of where we don't want to go to, but at the same time giving enough of a picture of a recognizable present, that we should say, hey, but maybe we're on the path. And boy, it was an interesting read, and I congratulate Dianna again.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Taylor. So this is the close of our time today. I appreciate all of you for tuning in. I think we almost had 100 or so folks tuning in for this live broadcast of this very important information and wonderfully helping to launch Dianna McCaulay's new novel, Daylight Come. So thank you all for this. I would like to send a special thank you, of course, to our author, Dianna McCaulay. Thank you so much. Thank you to her publisher, People Tree Press. Thank you to Rachel Mosley Wood, the head of the Department of Literatures in English. Therese Ferguson. Thank you to Yashika Graham and to Dion Jackson Miller, to Danilyn Swaby, to Professor Michael Taylor. Thank you to the entire Department of Literatures in English staff. That includes Whitney Eaton, Antoinette Jackson, Venice Gordon Francis, and of course, we will thank MITS Multimedia for assisting and hosting this virtual event. Thank you, Ishmael Preston. I really appreciate your help. We all do. And thank you all for joining in. We look forward to hosting you again for another exciting event. But for now, everyone, please find your way to a bookshop online or on land to purchase Daylight Come by Dianna McCaulay. Thank you all.